After the successes of Naruto Storm in 2008 and Naruto Storm 2 in 2010, Bandai Namco was looking to continue the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm series. However, when development began for their next entry, the anime and manga hadn't finished the next story arc yet. So rather than creating an incomplete story mode, developer CyberConnect 2 developed Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm Generations, a spin-off game that was made not only to keep fans engaged with the series until its next mainline entry, but also to rectify complaints that fans had with its previous entries. And while it certainly does fix some of the problems with the previous games, such as implementing originally cut content, as well as implementing some long requested gameplay changes, it does ultimately feel unnecessary. Naruto Storm 2 released in October of 2010 and went on to be a huge success. And not even a year later, Bandai Namco would announce the development of its sequel, Naruto Storm Generations, in June 2011 in Weekly Shonen Jump. Along with this announcement, they also promised the return of Part 1 characters, specifically Zabuza and Haku, who were noticeable exclusions in Naruto Storm 1. Why couldn't they have just been in Storm 2? In November of that same year, Bandai would announce the Japanese release date is February 13th, 2012, as well as provide some further information about why this game even deserved to exist in the first place. The idea here was that CyberConnect 2 wanted to satisfy many of the requests made from players about Storm 1 and Storm 2. We can place the requests into two main categories, the first of which being better gameplay. Many players wanted more traditional fighting game mechanics so that the game could be played more competitively as opposed to the heavily casual experience of the previous games. The second big request was with the new and returning characters. There were a number of excluded characters in previous games, the fan favorites being Zabuza and Haku, who would finally make their debut in Generations. This game would also see the inclusion of both Part 1 and Part 2 versions of the main cast, since those younger versions didn't return in Storm 2, hence the name Generations. Those additions were cool and all, but do they really warrant an entirely new game? Let's see how others responded at the time. Naruto Storm Generations released in Japan on February 23rd, 2012, with North America following shortly after on March 13th, and Europe a week later on March 30th. It was released on the PS3 and Xbox 360, and is the only game in the series to never get a PC release. Damn it. The game's reception, while not as overwhelmingly positive as Storm 2, was still generally positive. IGN gave it an 8.5 out of 10, GameSpot a 7 out of 10, and Famitsu a 36 out of 40. On Metacritic, it currently sits at a 74 critic score and a 6.8 user score. It sold well, but not as well as its predecessor. Generations had sold over 1 million copies by July 2012, about 3 months after release, whereas Storm 2 had already sold over 2 million copies by December 2010, which was only 2 months after its initial release. When looking through these reviews, the most common comment is that the gameplay has been greatly improved. However, the rest of the game just pales in comparison, with an incredibly lackluster story mode and not much else to do. So let's find out if Naruto Storm Generations really was a necessary addition to the Storm series. The improved gameplay is the clear standout feature of this game. Even now, there are people who still cite Generations as having the best gameplay out of the whole series. With this game, CyberConnect 2 specifically attempted to make Storm a more competitive fighting game. The first change, and the most obvious one, has been a long time coming, that being the new substitution jutsu meter. In Storm 1 and 2, you could use chakra to substitute out of your opponent's attacks, however it required incredibly precise timing, which meant it was pretty tricky to pull off. Now you have a specific substitution meter, which allows for 4 uses. The timing does not need to be anywhere near as exact, which shifts the focus of this move into resource management. You can technically spam all 4 uses in a row, but doing this will make the meter recover slower, as regeneration speed increases over time and with damage taken, but the speed will reset every single time you use a substitution. The second biggest change is with cancelling. New to this game are a number of different ways to cancel your basic attack strings and tilt attacks into other moves such as a neutral jump, a chakra dash, and a ninja move, which make longer and more complex combos possible, increasing the skill ceiling. Even just these two changes make a large effect on the overall game, but there are also a number of other additions too, such as mid-air chakra dash and new ninja tools. The gameplay is definitely an improvement over Storm 2's. I'd say Storm 1, while it had more unique mechanics, was the definitive casual experience, whereas Storm Generations here is a more definitive competitive experience. But you know what isn't a definitive experience? Generations story mode. Here's the problem with Generations. The anime and manga were still in the middle of the 4th Great Ninja War arc, and CyberConnect 2 didn't want to develop an incomplete story mode. That's understandable, so instead we get a handful of character-specific campaigns that are incredibly underwhelming and play like glorified arcade modes. There are story modes for young Naruto, Sasuke, Zabuza, Itachi, Killer Bee, Tobi, Kakashi, Jiraiya, Gaara, and Minato. It sounds like a lot of content, but it's really not. Each story mode is just a bunch of regular fights strung together by either anime screenshots and text boxes, or by anime scenes, some of which were originally produced for this game. Although, those usually just change slight details from the actual anime, more often than not, just censoring certain scenes to feature less violence. And that's it! However, credit where credit is due, this game is responsible for the Killer Bee rap song. Remember in Storm 1 when it had a fully explorable Konoha, where you could traverse around the whole village completing side quests and finding collectibles? Remember Naruto Storm 2 when it had essentially a full RPG story mode with multiple lands to explore, coupled with some incredibly unique and fun boss fights? Generations has none of those things. No free roaming of any capacity, no RPG elements, and no boss fights. These were the things that really sold the original games. Storm inherently is not a very competitive fighter, so a lot of the appeal came from the great story modes. So just completely ditch those in this entry feels weird. I know the gameplay was changed to become more competitive, and I really appreciate that, but they really couldn't have just waited for Storm 3 to implement those changes and include great single player content. I feel like the developers just didn't focus on the story mode at all, and it was really just a last minute addition. So let's move on to the character roster, which they were hyping up even before this game's release. In an interview prior to Generations release, CyberConnect 2 president Hiroshi Matsuyama claimed that it would allow players to be able to access every single character that they've actually seen in the whole series. But guess what? Lars from Storm 2 didn't make a return. So that was a lie. Aside from him, every character from Storm 1 and Storm 2 are back, alongside some new additions from Part 1 and from early in the Ninja War arc. There are 72 fully playable characters, with a number of additional support-only characters. With this entry, we finally got fan-favorite characters Zabuza and Haku, who were originally cut from Storm 1. It's great to finally have them alongside having the younger cast return from Storm 1. While their movesets are largely the same, they did have their ultimates edited, as Storm 1 ultimates were mad long, with the series opting for much quicker ultimates starting with Storm 2. Some other new characters are from the War arc, such as the Kages, and we also get young versions of Kakashi and Obito. It's great to have these characters, but it honestly feels pretty lackluster. The big idea was that this was Generations, the merging of Part 1 and Part 2 Naruto, but the only new Part 1 characters were Zabuza and Haku. The rest of the characters were just ported from Storm 1. It would have been nice to see other prominent characters make their debut, such as Kurenai and Anko, because the majority of the new characters here are solely from Shippuden. I get what they were going for this roster, but I don't think they really lived up to the hype that they were setting. In terms of presentation, you already know what I'm gonna say. The graphics and animations are great, I like the menus and UI, and the character select screen is pretty cool too. Keep that in mind for when we look at future Storm games. Is Naruto Storm Generations bad? No, it's not a bad game by any means. There are noticeable and substantial gameplay differences that are definitely a step up from Storm 2. It truly is a deeper, more complex experience compared to its predecessor. There are new characters, and while I would have liked to see more, there are undoubtedly long requested characters who finally made their debut, and it's nice to finally have both Part 1 and Part 2 versions of characters in the same game. With its lackluster story mode, it just doesn't feel like a full experience. Naruto Storm 3 would go on to release only the next year after Generations did. You're telling me Bandai really couldn't have waited just one more year to add these additions to Storm 3 and give fans a more complete game? This really just brings me back to my main question. Was Storm Generations ever really necessary? I would have said yes, because of the lack of overall new content, and without a proper story mode, which is what the Storm series is really known for. But Storm 3 would go on to undo a bunch of this game's gameplay mechanics and make it honestly play a whole lot worse. So, good job Bandai, you justified this game's existence in the dumbest way possible.